All right, everybody, welcome to your first actual online lecture and welcome to my home. This is my art. I did not paint it, but I did make this thing. Anyhow, the first thing we're going to go through is what we call the Geographers Toolkit. You can label these notes Unit 1, you can label them Geographers Toolkit. Basically, this is the basics that you need to use to go through and understand the crazy big concepts we're going to talk about. But first, we need to understand how these maps and visuals that we're going to use throughout class. Remember, geography is just basically implementing ideas over space and time. How we're going to use these things is incredibly important. So, in your notes, Unit 1 is called, which you might have noticed. Oops, sorry. Geography, Natures, and Perspectives. And this is the tools for understanding the study of geography. I'm blocking her, but here's a woman up. Where is she? She's right there. Bing, doing geography. Anyhow, the first tool we're going to use is the tool of understanding and mapping spatial data. So make sure you mark that word, spatial data. You should, by the way, be taking Cornell notes on every online lecture I have. There's almost always a quiz after them, and I'll check your notes tomorrow. So the first tool we have for mapping and understanding spatial data, and spatial data is any data that we see in space. So notice that this data, this is information we're getting across a space, and that space in this case is the United States. One of the tools we'll use to define spatial data in your notes, sorry I'm a little all over the place right now, I just got home, is the categorization. And the categorization we're going to go over tomorrow, but basically it's a way to show the top 10 of one feature on the same map as we show the bottom 10. So we might look at income on a map, and all of the richest people would be one color and all of the poorest areas would be a different color. So we're going to use what's called a categorization. You don't need to know that until tomorrow. However, you do need to know what space is. I said spatial data and I referenced space, and I hope you weren't thinking like, yeah, man, like outer space. No. We're thinking space, which is literally the physical gap or interval between two things, the space between them. That's all it is. When we talk about space in geography, we're talking about area. You also need to know the word distribution. And distribution is just the arrangement of a feature in space. So if I asked you, how are these red marks distributed on this map, you would give me some pattern or grouping or something like that. So distribution is just how things are distributed over space. And together, that gives us spatial distribution. Spatial distribution is the measurement of how things are distributed over space. Pretty easy. See? Make sure you write all that stuff. You don't have to write everything you see, but you have to write enough to understand. Now, pay very close attention to what's going to come next, because it sounds easy, but it can be very complicated. When we talk about spatial distribution, there are a number of words that I expect you from now on to use forever, and you better believe these are going to be on your test tomorrow. The first is density, and density is a measure of how frequently something occurs in space, measured by the total number of that thing in a certain area. Or, in other words, density is the amount of something in a certain area. If you look over here, there is a small density. In this case, you'd say a low density of dots, in a low density of cities in this big area. In this same size area, you would say there's a high density, meaning there are a lot of them when compared by the total number, when compared to this certain area of other places. So there's a high density of cities here and a low density of cities here. You guys remember osmosis and all that stuff from science? Same stuff. One thing that's really interesting about human geography is that we can use other measures to figure out density instead of just dots and data. For example, we see a high density of light on the east coast of the United States, which leads us to assume that there are more cities on the east coast of the United States. If you go back, it holds true on this map as well. We see some interesting spatial data here. We take a look at Africa. We see it all dark in the middle and on the edges. We see some mega cities. Take a look at Japan. You could drive all the way up from the bottom to the top of Japan and never leave a city. You see the one road in Russia that goes all the way across? Maybe there's two. I don't know. Interesting, though. The other word you're going to need to know is concentration. It's different than density, but concentration is a particular feature's spread over space. Its spread, or the way it looks, can be clustered, meaning close together, or dispersed, meaning relatively far apart. So you could have something of very high density, but that density could be either clustered or dispersed, if that makes sense. So it's either clustered, meaning things are really close together. Here's an example of clustered data. Look at all the little reds are smooshed together. And dispersed, here's well, that's not a very good example, but this would be a good example. See how the dark reds are kind of dispersed far apart? And in this case, size and area do matter. So when we're measuring the size of the area, if a cluster matters and its distance when compared to the size of the area matters. Are you all confused yet? That's okay. It's your first online lecture. Just buckle in and keep writing. Here are just two examples of clustered and dispersed. So this would be a town that is dispersed. Look at all the different towns pooping out over pooping out. Well, who said that? I need to regather myself. Okay, don't say weird things like pooping out. So you can see all these little towns popping out all over the place, with a distance from each other. And then here you can see that they are clustered. These little townhouses are clustered next to each other. Pretty simple when you look at an example, right? Geography is just about really complicated things, explanations of things that are very easy to see. When we see patterns, a pattern comes in many different shapes and sizes. Literally. So one of the patterns we see would be a linear distribution, which is when something follows a line. Take a look here at a road, right? These houses follow that line. If you take a look here where we find, is that the Missouri or the Mississippi River? I don't know. You'll see a linear distribution of towns that follow that pattern. Where you also will see geometric grid patterns. You see those all over in cities, right? Roads go in grids, and then we see those patterns floating around. So it's pretty interesting what you can see with this kind of data. Here's a geometric grid pattern. Isn't that fascinating? Built around a center of a city over time. So tomorrow, you have a quiz on this information. You should definitely be able to tell me the difference between density and concentration. We will do some pre-test stuff so you don't have to stress, some review. But basically, we are going to use concentration, density, and pattern and use those words to describe what we see on a map. And that's going to be your test tomorrow on top of a small multiple choice test. So good job on your first one. If you were confused, just go back and write down what you hear. And then if you have more questions tomorrow, we will go over it again in class. I hope you guys are having a great evening. See ya. Oh, it's still recording.